I'm Ted Swift, a co-director of Maich Swift Architects, and I'm going to show some images and drawings from a project for a grouping of artist residency studios on a large rural estate in Scotland, which is still in development. It received planning permission last year, and we hope to start works later this year on site. A big part of this project to us is about the careful balance between new buildings and the wider context of the estate, addressing ecological, wildlife and nature legislation and considering the full life cycle and impact of the buildings on their surrounds. As a practice, we have an interest in using simple construction methods and try to create a strong architectural character through modest and direct means. One of the studios is shown in this image. The project involves the adaptation of an existing stone building for accommodation and the construction of 4 timber buildings, 3 of which are studios. One of them is an ancillary building for the residency. These models were made quite early on in the project, and this photograph taken on our office steps captures the themes of the project quite well, which are timber, stone and plants. The estate's located in North East Perthshire along the Highland fault line in Scotland. It's between the Cairngorms National Park to the north and the lowlands to the south. What makes this project special and interesting for us are the ecological and scenic qualities of the site and the challenge of how we might try to reconcile the small scale development of a set of artist studios with the management of the estate, which is moving towards a less controlled form of land management to one which advocates biodiversity and uncultivated land. The model of the country estate has had to adapt over history, and the Bamff Estate is one such example that, in order to have a sustainable future, is concentrated on shifting the land use away from production and the picturesque to one of sustainable practices and ecology. The lands belong to the Ramsay family since the early 13th century, and each generation has had their own idea of land management and what should be grown on the estate. Over the course of the Ramsay stewardship of the land, clearance for farming and other uses has occurred, as well as reforestation. The site for the project can be seen here, with the main estate buildings over here. About 1/3 of the estate is woodland. This plan of 1790 was prepared by Thomas White, who was a pupil of Capability Brown, for the improvement of the landscape gardens on the estate, which introduced picturesque features like the ribbon lake and the planting of hundreds of beech trees. Later on, larch, conifers, Sitka spruce and Douglas fir were planted on the peripheries of the estate to support forestry. The estate currently comprises 1,300 acres of farmland, coniferous and broadleaf woodland, wetland and heather moorlands. The current owners reintroduced beavers to the estate in 2002, and they've committed to an ambitious project to replace large areas of marginal farmland with conservation grazing, and will allow the land to adapt into self-seeded mixed woodlands. Bamff House was first built in the 16th century and is shown in the bottom left of this 19th century plan. Ancillary buildings, stores and stables are to the north, along with a walled garden. And circled in red here is the site for the project and the grouping of buildings which are known as the Burney Shed of Bamff. The existing buildings sit in a small clearing surrounded by mature trees which shelter the site, beech trees to the west, and then larch trees to the east. A river runs adjacent to the site, to the south and then north. And this forms a wide riparian edge, which is a key part of the forest ecosystem. Access to the site is very limited and it can only be reached on foot. There's a drover's path running from the south up to the site, but that's not currently in use. This large field here will no longer be used for farming, and it's planned that eventually it will become a self-seeded forest. The previous grouping of buildings has since gone, and the remaining structures have fallen into disrepair. These were formerly the gamekeeper's cottage and the kennels. The body of water in this photograph is the beaver pond. The beavers are continually changing this area through dams and coppicing trees. In turn, new growth has appeared around the pond, with self-seeded trees starting to emerge around the site. So the project brings back into use the area around the two dilapidated buildings and introduces two new separate lightweight timber buildings within the clearing. The studios themselves avoid specific requirements in favour of adaptability and flexibility. So these studios are not dedicated to any particular type of practice, and they'll be used for short periods of time, probably up to 1 month. The legislation in place to protect the ecological value of the site has been incorporated into the construction plan from early on in the project. Rather than seeing this as an obstacle, it's led us to design the studios with a significant amount of consideration for flexibility and use and low ecological impact. This loose arrangement of buildings will provide various types of spaces for artists in residence, which afford both communal and more secluded spaces, but which will retain a close relationship to the broader landscape which surrounds the site. The new buildings occupy the existing clearing, roughly replicating the former arrangement of buildings and following the tree line. Timber platforms sitting on stones found lying around the site will make a series of raised landings and crossings connecting the buildings. These will also provide infrastructure to distribute electrical and service connections between the buildings without needing to excavate the ground. So the existing Burney Shed building is a typical longhouse type and was partly converted some 20 years ago. The western part of this building has no roof and the walls have partly collapsed. A new timber structure will sit within the walls here. The kennel building is located further down the slope leading to the pond. A new timber structure is to be installed within the existing footprint of the walls in the same manner as the Burney Shed ruin. Then a standalone timber structure is proposed to the north of the existing Burney Shed building, which closes off the group into a loose courtyard type, albeit a very informal one. And the new studio replicates the gable end form of this building. Finally, a new outbuilding provides communal facilities, including water collection, a composting toilet and showers. The estate's management plan is in counter to traditional conservation, which preserves the landscape in a particular state. Instead, at Bamff, the land and its inhabitants, both plant and animal, are allowed to become more self-willed. This image is from a book called The Ecological Relations of Roots, showing patterns from the world underneath, and sets a position for the project, fundamentally one of care and attention to the context. So this has affected how we consider the construction method, as well as planning how the buildings might be inhabited with the client. Large stones most likely Perthshire limestone or granite will lift the buildings above ground level and provide a fixing point for the new structures to avoid disruption to the existing roof systems. Staddle stones were traditionally used in parts of Scotland and England to raise granaries or larders off the ground to stop rodents getting to the food stock. But in our case, raising the new structures will allow for airflow beneath and around the building to encourage vegetation to grow around the timber structures. The raising up of the buildings above ground level on stones and lifting of pathways addresses an attitude of the client to touch the ground lightly in both construction and use, and to allow for a degree of future adaptation, adjustment, or eventual removal. This plan shows the relationship of stone buildings, stone foundations, and tree trunks, and could show the project at either the start or the end of its life. We've resisted traditional restoration and any substantial works to the existing stone walls in favour of doing as little as possible. The walls will be stabilised and capped with a soft turf and vegetation to protect the existing stonework from water penetration. And in this context, we thought the stone walls should be seen as a productive constraint, which has informed the positioning of buildings within rather than on top of the walls. The soft capping method is sometimes used on historic structures as an alternative to using concrete to stop water ingress and damage to stone walls. Each of the new buildings share a material and construction language. They differ in scale, degrees of flexibility and adaptability, and the extent to which one can separate oneself from other activities happening on site. The family of structures share relative proportion, setting out rules and sizing. The image on the right by Idris Khan shows every burnt and Hillebecker gable-sided house overlaid, and on the left is each of the elevations for the Burnyshed site arranged in a similar manner. The original buildings in Western Germany, photographed by the Beckers, were built in accordance with a 1790 law, which incidentally is around the same time as the beech trees were being planted on the estate. This law prescribed the minimum amount of timber structurally required and prohibited the construction of elements for ornamental purposes. It was enacted to save wood for iron production. When appraising the construction method, we've considered appropriate ways to limit disturbance to the site and make the project viable in construction terms and buildable on a limited budget. Prefabrication of the frames is planned in one of the larger ancillary buildings to the main house. The planning of prefabricated structures also lends itself to the eventual disassembly of the buildings. The Lustron House, which is an enamelled steel house building system developed in the 1940s, is shown here disassembled and rearranged. These single-storey houses were supposed to complete very quickly in 360 working person hours. We've also considered Walter Siegel's method of self-build and applied his rigorous simplification methodology to the project. Along with lessons learnt from our Potemkin Theatre project, which was organised by the Architecture Foundation and was self-built by the practice in 2019. This photograph is of the theatre where the frames were raised into position on the rooftop using pulleys and a hand winch. And as a student, I took part in the construction of this belvedere designed by David Grandorge at the Bamff Estate in Somerset. The green oak frames had to be manually carried up the escarpment into place. Each of the buildings use consistent sawn timber section sizes using only timber bolted or screwed together in platform frame construction. The structures are set out using readily available materials in standard sizes, so there's minimal cutting and waste and no wet trades. An important but perhaps obvious question for us was, how should a studio look in this setting? The buildings are not residential or rural, and we felt they needed to be emblematic of a studio rather than too directly suggesting an idea about vernacular. In relation to the setting, we've approached the design in a way which might be described as primitive and practical, and this has driven the formal and material decisions. With regards to form, we looked at Rachel Whiteread's Shy sculptures, which are negative casts of prefabricated structures, huts, sheds or military structures, for their familiar but strange relationship to the landscape. The simple form of the buildings and straightforward material considerations are determined by economy and buildability. New structures will be clad with larch, which will be milled from trees felled on the estate. The cladding pattern uses standard graded roofing battens, which are pressure treated, leading to the red finish, whilst rough sawn larch will be left unfinished so that over time it weathers grey and merges with the bark of the surrounding trees. Internally, the linings will be sheep's wool insulation, which will be held in place with jute netting, both of which can be sourced locally, and then elsewhere linings will be spruce plywood. The timber structure of the new studio occupies the western part of the stone wall ruin and is placed inbound of the existing walls to address issues of buildability and movement of air and light, but also to retain the feeling of occupying a ruin. The buildings entered between the existing stone walls and the new studio with a small external enclosed area connecting the eastern side of the longhouse. The arrangement of window openings is defined loosely for a particular view or an orientation to draw in light during a certain time of day. They're set forward of the structural timber, so trimming out of the opening isn't necessary, and we'll use large sheets of polycarbonate in softwood frames to aid the simple fixing and transport of the windows to the site. The smaller windows on the upper levels are openable to allow for natural ventilation of the spaces. All of the structures are designed to permit adaptation. The structural design allows for a first floor or a mezzanine to be added for extra accommodation or studio space. We imagine this space might be used as a generous hall-like room suitable for a range of uses. This studio has a close connection to the existing house, which is built on the eastern part of the same stone-walled structure. Limited works will be carried out to make the existing building habitable, which is already partly refurbished. It will be insulated and reclad using larch shingles, which are offcuts from the cladding of the other building. Covered walkway makes a terrace overlooking the beaver pond and reorientates this building to the south. The East Burnley shed provides the more communal spaces of the grouping of buildings and a more domestic character. The kitchen area and living room on the ground floor and basic sleeping quarters on the first floor, which are accessed by a ladder at either end of the room. The pitched roof studio sits opposite the longhouse and encloses the grouping of buildings at the northern side of the site. The large overhanging eaves provide covered external working space. And the building is orientated east-west, the same as the other studio spaces, firstly to gather northern light, but also to take advantage of solar thermal gains in the winter on the long south side. Small wood burning stoves fueled by coppicing from the estate provide space heating when required, and thick natural insulation more than regulations require, and careful airtightness detailing, which is aided by the prefabrication process, combine to make basic but comfortable inhabitation. As with the studio in the ruin, this structure has been designed to support another floor, and the internal bracing lends a framework for the spaces to be partitioned should the need arise. This building is connected by a raised walkway to the outbuilding, an open veranda type structure, which provides ancillary spaces, storage, showers, and composting toilets. 2 large water tanks collect water from the roof of this building. The overhanging eaves on the other structures will push water away from the buildings to avoid the problem of block gutters requiring maintenance. But on the outbuilding, the lower, more accessible profiled aluminium roof collects water for general use around the site. By virtue of its remote location, the site lends itself to an off-grid servicing strategy in the long term. For the time being, the existing Burney Shed building has a mains electrical and potable water connection, which will be extended across the site underneath the walkways. The outbuilding uses a simple structural frame with diagonal bracing to allow for larger openings, and is left uninsulated and open for ventilation, and provides an external covered workspace or meeting place beside the twin water tanks. The most southerly building is located further down the slope towards the beaver pond. The new structure sits within the old walls of the kennel building in the same manner as the Burney Shed ruin. Windows will frame views of both the pond and borrow light reflecting off the adjacent stone walls. This smaller one-story building utilises the same construction method and detailing as the other studios. Whereas the larger studios offer more wide-ranging uses, the scale and location of this studio building lends itself to more isolated working and the idea of a retreat or a hide due to the proximity to the beaver habitat. A lesson for us from the beavers is that all solutions are at best provisional ones, and similarly, no building on the estate is now configured or used quite as they originally intended to be. We hope that our approach to the design will help the studios and artists coexist with the changing landscape in a good-natured way. And we hope to start works on site this autumn.